Yeah, yeah. Just and have them introduce themselves. Yeah, yeah. Good morning. Jeff had a rough night, and not the fun kind. It's tough blowing out your Achilles 3 weeks before the conference. This morning we wanted to really talk about not only what has happened with BEAD, but much more importantly, where we can go from here. John Wilkins of Quadra Partners in DC is a co-founder. He's going to lead a lively panel this morning, and we'll have time for a few questions near the end. So thank you. Please welcome John and the panel.
Thanks, Doug. You know, when I walked into the hotel yesterday, I truly had a sense of deja vu. So 1 year ago, this hotel, this event, we were all talking about BEAD, states getting close to making awards, what was going to happen after BEAD. A year later, we're back in the same hotel, same conference, talking about the same thing. But you know, just sort of turn the expression on its head slightly. You know, the more things stay the same, the more they change. So it is a very different environment for BEAD now. We've got a panel that I'm going to introduce quickly, but they don't need much of an introduction. And we're going to hopefully have a very good, interesting, candid conversation about how we got here and especially what's coming next. Let me just quickly, for the 1 or 2 people in the room that haven't been following BEAD, recap where we are. Okay, 4 years ago, this summer, Congress was debating the infrastructure bill, signed the BEAD portion of it, $42 billion for broadband infrastructure. To those of us that have been involved in policy and industry and broadband for a long time, it was stunning, it was unprecedented. We're going to talk about that. A year ago, like I said, states have been working for several years. We're getting close to moving forward. 6 months ago, during the presidential transition, there was a lot of discussion about would there be much change. A lot of people thought, well, maybe not. 2 months ago, June 6th, you know, one of my friends in the state said it was sort of the electromagnetic pulse of the BEAD program. The June 6th policy notice made a bunch of fundamental changes, and every state had to basically go and rerun process under those new rules. 2 months later, to the day now, to the credit of many of the state folks in this room, if you see one, give them a pat on the back. Pretty much every state has managed to now rerun their process under those new rules. And in the next, you know, not months, but weeks, we're about to find out the results of what these new benefit of the bargain rounds have been. And I'll just say, as someone that, you know, has been involved in this for a long time, I have a lot of experience on the policy side. I don't have the slightest idea what's going to happen. I mean, the range of possible outcomes here is really broad, and hopefully our panel here will give us some insight, maybe make a few predictions. So I'm going to do real quick introductions, and then we're going to do probably 3 rounds of questions, maybe some back and forth, and we will definitely try to leave 10 minutes or so for audience questions as well. So I'm just going to go down the row here. Evan Feinman, probably needs no introduction. Former director of the BEAD program, and for those going on 3 years, Evan was the closest day-to-day person running the BEAD program, you know, and since then has remained involved too. So we're going to get Evan's take. Next to Evan, Kevin Gallagher. I think folks know he was Secretary Raimondo's senior advisor, not just for BEAD, but for the whole kind of panoply of infrastructure, economic development programs at the Commerce Department. So brings that kind of one level up from NTIA. What does this look like from that broader perspective? If anybody doesn't know who Gigi is, you're in the wrong conference. You know, go across the street there to the FinTech one maybe. So you know what? Gigi has been involved in broadband for longer than anybody here. You know, wears many hats. Good friend of mine. Look her up in the agenda if you want to see her long CV. And then at the end, Veneeth Iyengar, the director of the Louisiana Broadband Office. Again, folks that know BEAD know that Louisiana has long been, you know, one of the leading states, was the first state to have its prior, now rescinded final proposal approved, very much has been on the kind of cutting edge of what's happening in BEAD. And I think Veneeth will try to give us a sense of what actually is happening right now from the state perspective. Okay, so I'm gonna sit down, and then we'll do 1 round of questions each. Back and forth, another round, back and forth, another round, and then we'll take questions from y'all. Okay. I'm gonna jump around. I'm not gonna go down the row. I'm gonna give Gigi the first word here. Okay, so Gigi, I talked about how unprecedented the 42 billion seems. I think there's been a lot of hyperbole about how unprecedented, how amazing, how different all this is. Reality check. How unprecedented is what's happening now, really? Have we seen this movie before? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Like, kind of put it in perspective, given how long you've sort of been involved in all these issues.
Yeah, I don't want to sound trite, but elections have consequences, right? You and I were at the FCC together with Tom Wheeler in 2013, and we, changed the whole dynamic of broadband regulation, including classifying broadband as Title II service. We changed E-rate, we changed Lifeline. I mean, we completely changed the landscape of policy. Then Trump won, and Ajit Pai turned it right back around again, right? So it's not unusual when a new administration comes in to take what was done before and change it. So in that way, what has happened here is not unprecedented. What is unprecedented about this administration is its willingness to flout the will of Congress. We've all been talking about BEAD, but nobody has talked about the Digital Equity Act. I don't know, nobody. I haven't gone to every single conference. I can't split myself into 5, right? But, one day, Donald Trump posts on Truth Social that the Digital Equity Act and the grants, some of which were already, provisionally made, were unconstitutional, and he was taking the money back, despite the fact that the money was, authorized and appropriated lawfully by Congress in the IIJA. And when we talk about the non-deployment money, I think one of the greatest fears is that the same will happen. That despite the fact that it is in the law that the state should be able to have this money to do other things with if they use the money efficiently, the BEAD money efficiently, and save money, that the states will never see that money because Howard Lutnick and Donald Trump will decide, sorry, we're going to take it back. So that's what's unprecedented, and that is what is causing so much uncertainty. I feel like a yo-yo. Like, we read the policy statement and we said, oh, well, I think the states can work with this. This won't be so bad. Then, you see some of the results coming out of the states, and you're like, oh, my God. And then, you read the FAQ, and you say, oh, that's not so bad. They're giving the states all this, leeway to decide what a priority broadband project is. So, the uncertainty and just the up and down is it's really painful. But I think this administration thrives in that environment. Mm-hmm. So that's really what's unprecedented here. I want to make just one other point, John, I think is really important, and I think people need to remember. I said there was a lot of panels yesterday. There's a lot of talk about satellite versus fixed wireless versus fiber, and we talk in these technological terms, and we keep forgetting that this broadband impacts people's lives, right? It impacts their ability to see a doctor, to go to school and do their homework, right? To communicate with friends and family overseas. We can't lose that personal element of why this is so important. And I think we need to start talking about that more and less about this technology versus that technology.
So we'll talk about non-deployment, I think, as this goes on. But Veneeth, on that last comment Gigi made, let me go to you. So I think we're 1 month away from the 20th anniversary of Katrina.
It's a couple of weeks, actually.
And that on-the-ground experience, I know, has changed a lot of the thinking in Louisiana about a lot of these issues. So just talk about it a little bit. How, not just about BEAD, but more broadly, how in the state of Louisiana this question of infrastructure in these areas is so important.
Yeah, so look, hurricane season in Louisiana, I think started a couple of months ago, and it's going to end November 30th, right? The waters are warmer. The hurricanes are not just forming off the coast of Africa and plodding along. You have hurricanes, especially I think Katrina, and then in 2021 it was Hurricane Ida, both that within a couple of days formed in the Caribbean and then just went up the Gulf Coast and through Louisiana, Mississippi, and it's on its way. And so when we have those kinds of occurrences, the number one issue, the number one complaint we get from folks is, if you're going to build this infrastructure that's going to last, that's going to be resilient, why didn't you do it the first time around? right? If you have the financial resources to be able to build infrastructure that will last a long time, then why don't you do that? Now, we also learned, and we also realized in Louisiana that, look, there are folks that have fishing camps, dog camps, the folks that live in different parts of the state where the cost of building that infrastructure may not be the most generated ROI, right? And so from the governor's perspective, his philosophy has always been, Governor Landry's perspective is, if we can get Louisianians, especially in the rural parts of the state, the best, most resilient infrastructure in the most cost-efficient way, then that's really a win-win for all. And so we hear those challenges. Personally, Thomas and I, who's spoken, look, we get constituent calls every day. We get constituent calls from folks that have said, look, I need to come back to Louisiana. I need to move back to Louisiana to take care of my parents. I need to move back to Louisiana because I've convinced my employer that I can now work from Louisiana and I can telework, right? That is a critical part of the economic development strategy for the governor. A strategy of getting people to come back to Louisiana because we have been shedding tons of people to other states. A core part of our workforce development, economic development strategy, it's always been very tactically for the governor, is to get people back. And when people come back, one of the first things they're assessing is the quality of connectivity, right? And so we have folks that, we had a nuclear engineer from Michigan who's moving back to Louisiana. And inadequate infrastructure is not going to be good enough for him to be able to have a livelihood in North Louisiana, which is critically important. And so from our perspective, from the governor's perspective, the best infrastructure for Louisiana that is going to be the most resilient, but also a way in which we can create cost efficiencies is going to be important.
Kevin, I'm going to go to you now. So Gigi talked about every 4 years, new administration, things change. That's life in Washington. BEAD obviously was a big, but far from the only grant program at Commerce that definitely was intended to be sort of a integrated strategy. I know that, when you were there, that was how you thought about it. BEAD in the context of everything else at the Commerce Department, what kind of changes are you seeing? Like, what do you see happening now, given that, change is inevitable with new administration? Are other things changing as much as BEAD? Like, how's it all kind of fitting together from what you're seeing?
I think, first let me say, one of the most profound things for me about how Congress created BEAD and where they placed it in the Infrastructure Act, making it the functional equivalent of roads and bridges, like that to me is what was originally fundamental about BEAD. The fact that Congress saw it as an enabler for driving economic development, driving commerce, and it put it on the same level playing field as the importance of roads and bridges. And so that's how we thought about it at the Commerce Department. Gigi said that change is inevitable, and I think that's true. And there's lots of grant programs at Commerce. The CHIPS and Science Act vested Commerce with a significant amount of funding to catalyze semiconductor manufacturing. The Economic Development Administration got a bunch of money to help post-COVID communities recover economically. And I think we're seeing small changes to those programs through this administration, but not as fundamental as the changes they made to BEAD.
Okay. All right, Evan, last but not least here, and I'm going to ask you a question that's going to pivot us into, I think, the next round of sort of the retrospective part of this panel. So, I think folks know, when you left the federal service earlier this year, you made some pretty strong statements about things that you could see happening. I guess, what do you see happening a few months later? I know that you're involved in a lot of what's going on. Like, just what do you see happening with BEAD? You don't have to give me a prediction, but just where are you based on, your deep knowledge of the program?
Sure, yeah. I am no better an oracle today than I was several months ago or at any point in my life, but I might be able to provide you with a good segue. So, what I was really concerned about when, let me roll back a little prior to my departure. At the end of last year, I was working naively under the assumption that the BEAD program was going to be too good for the parts of the country that put the that provided the majority of the current administration's political support, and that as a result, while there were going to be cosmetic changes, they weren't going to be both self-injurious and injurious to that part of the country in their pursuit of whatever their other goals were. That was not the case. Instead, what we saw coming in was that a narrative that I think we did a bad job, especially toward the end of the Biden administration, pushing back on in as many places as it was being made. I think we were more hesitant to engage than we ought to have been, was allowed to take hold, that the program was dragging its feet, and that it was enmeshed in sort of this vast ocean of red tape. While there is more red tape in the federal government than there ought to be, I'm the first one to say that. When I first heard of DOGE, I was excited. I was like, okay, I've got a long list of things that are dumb that we do that we could get rid of. None of that ever came up. Instead, this sort of bad faith political narrative that about the slowness of the BEAD program and all of its woke requirements took hold and couldn't really be combated with actual statements of what was so. And so this pivot to, oh, Elon can solve it all, let's bring a ton of LEO in, was what really, really, really worried me, because while Starlink is a remarkable technology that offers a lot of good to a lot of people and will continue to pay dividends for this country and in fact connectivity around the world, it is not a replacement for terrestrial broadband. And the idea that all technology is the same and therefore we should act in a technologically neutral way is both violative of the spirit of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as well as the letter of it. And so what I saw when I exited was a push toward a flattening of requirements, a removal of discretion from the states, and a hewing much more closely to the program design models that we've seen before that haven't worked, things like RDOF and CAF. And I was really concerned about that, but the job was not done. There's sort of the program had done a bounce on the trampoline. It had begun its flip. I left and I said, look, I think this thing's going to land on its head. Here we are now. It hasn't fully landed, right? But like the head is a couple inches above the fabric, and you know your brother's on the sideline saying, we're already calling for mom, right? Like there's a problem. And sorry, I brought up a little past trampoline trauma here. The reality is there's going to be a ton more LEO than there needs to be. A bunch of people who are going to get really high quality, really affordable connections are instead going to get very expensive, much slower connections that are going to be out more often than they're not, or going to be inadequate more often than they're not. And that's a real shame. It's a missed opportunity. It's going to really affect the ability of public safety folks to do their work safely. It's going to affect the ability of rural communities to attract new talent. It's going to affect the work of economic developers and their ability to site new infrastructure. And if, in fact, the second step in this two-step is the clawing back of non-deployment funds, it's going to really affect the country's ability to be resilient in response to both natural and man-made disasters. And I have real concern about the missed opportunities reflected in all of that.
So, you know, I'm going to stay with you. So you already started to go there. Let's do the portion of this that's about kind of the retrospective, the what happened, and especially, you know, what lessons can be learned, not just for BEAD, but for other programs. So let me just go right back to you. So you said there were some things that, frankly, you would have been happy if the DOGE team had fixed. Say more about that. What were some of the things that you think could have worked better when you were in charge of the program? Like, what were some of, you know, the best moments, maybe the things that if you had to do it over again, you wouldn't? Like, how would you do that lessons learned for the next version of, you know, these sorts of infrastructure programs?
Well, some of it is about targeting your efforts, right? Like, everything doesn't need to be a Christmas tree that has nods toward, which is at the end of the day all they were, every single other priority of whichever party is in power. There was no particular reason for us to have Veneeth write us paragraphs in his initial and final proposals about how he was following federal labor law. Like, I suspect all of our state broadband offices are in fact planning to follow the law. If they're not, that's a law enforcement matter and none of our business. The same can be said for equal opportunity contracting, right? Like every state already has rules about open and fair contracting and procurement. These were not things that were really essential to the program, but what happens is once you make them a requirement, then if you're going to dot your I's and cross your T's, as Stephanie Wiener's in the back of the room, she was somebody who was requiring that we dot our I's and cross our T's as counsel. You know, you can't just say, oh, we don't care about that. It's like, well, you made it a requirement. The state has to write something, and they have to write something that's at least responsive to the requirement. And so we had a lot of back and forth. Community anchor institutions. We went back and forth for months with states. I mean, why you have to adequately justify that this is community. We shouldn't have messed around with any of that. We should have just said, look, this is an infrastructure program. It's about identifying locations and building stuff to them, and we should have focused on that. That would have saved some time, and we might have been advanced enough in the program's progress that the changes that the Trump administration made were not possible, you know, couldn't have been made because the horses would have been out of the barn. That said, it is also the case that the criticism that it has been however many days and the program has not connected any households has implicit within it a statement that's not actually supported by the evidence, which is that the program should have connected houses by that time. In 1939, when the Rural Electrification Act was passed, they knew they had a large undertaking before them. In 1949, 10 years later, they had not connected half the farms in the United States. It turns out identifying all these locations and building them is much harder, and I'm pretty sure in the 1940s, they weren't mired in woke red tape. They were like running a plow through a farmer's field, throwing a couple of bucks on his porch and moving on to the next thing. It's just hard and big and complex, especially when you got to stand up a new program, you got to support the states in standing up a new program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is all sort of the, here's what we could have done better, but at the end of the day, it is still true that the advice I gave the Trump administration at the outset was strip away the woke stuff that you don't like and then let the states move forward. That is still the best thing we could possibly do. And what I would encourage my former colleagues, whom I want to succeed at NTIA to do, is to be incredibly flexible in their interpretation of their current policy notice, to have their SAC meetings and to meet with the states and say, look, if you can make any kind of good argument to us about why we should support terrestrial infrastructure, I hope NTIA will be responsive to that, and I hope that the non-deployment funds, that we build a structure that allows the non-deployment funds to be used usefully in a way that will allow meaningful and robust use of the infrastructure that we're purchasing. It makes no sense to buy this stuff and then let the next storm blow it down.
John, I think it's sort of ironic for me. I spent a ton of time defending criticism of NTIA for moving too fast. Like that was actually a thing that you know, it's just an irony that I can't get past. When Congress wrote the infrastructure law, I remember being in a meeting with the secretary and the Senate bipartisan group, and they put in the statute a deadline for NTIA to publish the NOFO. And the staff just laughed at us and like, well, we're going to put it in there, but NTIA never hits those deadlines, so we don't expect you to actually get the thing out by this time period. And I'm proud to say that the team at NTIA published it early. They beat that deadline. You know, we waited a year for the FCC's maps, and states rightfully wanted the opportunity to challenge those maps because there were high stakes. We were going to make the allocation decisions based on those maps. And so we announced that we were going to make those allocations in June, providing a narrow window for states to file challenges. And I spent, I don't know how much time defending against criticism that that was too fast a timeline and that we should have waited till the next iteration of the maps, which would have pushed us out to making allocations in December as opposed to June. So, you know, as I think and reflect back on the timeline portion of this, this narrative has sort of shifted on us because there was a point in time where NTIA was moving too fast and people were saying these were too aggressive deadlines. A year between the initial proposal and the final proposal is not enough time, that states were going to need more time than that. And so for me, I think the one key lesson learned is really about setting expectations about exactly how long everything is going to take from the start, because everybody was anxious to get people connected. And we had a rapid program in the Biden administration to start building broadband. It just sat at Treasury. It didn't sit at Commerce. And had we just called it all BEAD, like, I think we'd be in a whole different world than we are today.
Sohn, can I just jump in just for a second?
Sorry, we're totally taking over.
No,
That's good.
no,
Hey,
I mean, I'm going to say something that may piss off some of my very good friends, but we should never have been in this position. The money should have been in the banks of the states by December 31st, 2024. And yes, you're absolutely right about all the maps. So there's basically been three narratives about why we are where we are right now. Number one, and people forget this, and I wish people would read the goddamn law, okay? Congress put in many steps. The woke provisions were put in by Congress for the most part, okay? So read the law. Congress, probably for good reason, wanted to protect its $42.5 billion investment, so it put in multiple proposals and multiple requirements. So that's one thing that pushed it back, okay? Another narrative was that, well, industry was fighting over particularly the low-cost thing with the states, and that caused some delay. Okay. But the third thing, and again, I'm going to anger some of my friends, is that NTIA was nitpicky. It took too long to cure, and they didn't act, most importantly, did not act with a sense of urgency, particularly at the beginning of 2024. I think somebody should have said, we have got to move heaven and earth. We don't know what's going to happen with this election. We've got to move heaven and earth to get the money to the states by the end of the year. And that didn't happen. So I think there's a combination of all those things. But I just think, again, the only reason to look back is so you don't make the same mistakes in the future. But I do think the lack of the sense of urgency, combined with everything else, we should not be in this position. Now we are, and we'll talk about how to move forward. But it's just a shame. That's all I could say. Sometimes, as a person who worked on worked on BEAD and worked on the Digital Equity Act, sometimes I want to cry because we have really taken so many steps back. But again, if you ignore the past, you know what happens.
so Veneeth, let me give you the last word on this. So while everyone here in DC is like having these debates, what's it look like in a state? Did you feel like things moved too slowly, too quickly? What would you have liked to see,
You have to match the urgency level that people need this stuff to both the policy and execution at the federal level. And so what we tried to do at a state level was shape-shift the conversations at NTIA over the last couple of years and tell them that, look, at the heart of what we're trying to solve for is to get that constituent internet. They don't really care about anything else. You make it the best that it can be, you make it the most cost competitive, you make it affordable. You have to oversimplify sometimes the challenge and then the solution. And so, yes, I mean, I think to be fair, and I think we've had, look, Evan, I think we've had conversations with you and your team, with explaining our frustration with the lack of urgency, sometimes the frustration of, look, we have all these constituent needs, we're in hurricane season every year, like we got to get moving. And so, yeah, I think there was gaps in timeline that could have been solved if the feds were more efficient in their processing of 5-year action plan, volume 1s, volume 2s, and so on and so forth.
Okay. We're now going to pivot to what I think probably in the room is most interested in, which is what's actually going to happen. I'm just going to go back to Evan, I guess. So you protested that you're not an oracle, but in the next couple of weeks, a lot of this is going to be revealed by states. What is and feel free to caveat it or give alternatives, but what do you think is going to happen? What is your best prediction, good, bad, otherwise, unusual? What do you see the next couple of weeks and months holding for the program?
I think we're going to see a lot of information about a whole lot of locations that we're going to get high quality terrestrial fixed wireless or fiber connections instead being lined up for LEO service, about which there are really fair questions as to its ability to perform just to clear the bottom rung, the lowest level to be in the category of broadband. And I think I know for a fact that a set of states reached out to NTIA and said, as we understand your rule set, and given the applications in front of us, we're going to need to award LEO to every single BEAD eligible location in our state. And NTIA said, whoa, 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 don't do that. And they said, okay, well, how do we not do that? And NTIA, that then led to some additional FAQs and some other work that NTIA has put out. But regardless, what we're going to see is a really dramatic shift toward satellite and away from more robust technologies like high-quality terrestrial fixed wireless and fiber. It should be made really clear to people what that means, right? So like to Veneeth's point, and there was also a really good column by a friend of mine, Jesse Ferguson, who wrote recently about, people in DC need to stop talking about their accomplishments and about laws they passed and about policy notices that they dropped and start talking about human beings and how this changes their lives. What this is gonna mean is hundreds of thousands of families are gonna have to pay more to get online every month than they were gonna have to pay before. And they're gonna have worse, slower service that often doesn't meet the definition of broadband. It will be interesting to see how up and down that is on a state-by-state basis, because we moved discretion out of state broadband offices and put it in the business development offices at Kuiper and Starlink, effectively. Because they got to decide how aggressively they were going to pursue these things, and the rule set gave them the ability to do that. And so it's going to be very up and down state by state. I think we're going to see some states where there's going to be a ton of LEO. I think we're going to see some states where it's going to look very similar to the way it would have looked had the BEAD program proceeded forward as it was going to. But what we need to be focused on, I think, as a country is, one, to what extent can a negotiation happen to improve those final proposal outcomes? Two, to what extent can we, those final proposals have to be made public. To what extent can we communicate with the public about what this means for them and their future, and the economic and social consequences of it for their future livelihoods and health and safety. And then three, what are we going to do about non-deployment? Because there's no reason for NTIA to be focused on driving the initial capital costs of these things down so far, were it not for a desire to claw back the non-deployment funds. There is nobody in the Commerce Department today who's so enamored of digital literacy classes, of device provision for low-income people, of even resiliency efforts, that they like it more than broadband infrastructure provision. And so I think we really need to, it will be interesting to see the extent of those changes, but that those changes will occur, I don't think is really up for debate.
Okay. All right, so Gigi, I want to ask your forward-looking view, but I want to broaden it slightly. Okay, so I think one thing that is clear, at the end of the BEAD program, when the dust settles, pretty much every location is going to have service. I mean, like, given the budget and just given all the work of the states, there is going to be these eligible locations have service from BEAD for almost every location. So what does that mean for other big programs that some people in this room participate in? Universal service?
John, I think there's an important, that's not necessarily true. Because we moved discretion away from SBOs and into business development offices that are set of ISPs, I mean, we just heard from Bree Mackey that nearly a third of the locations in Minnesota got no bids, not from a LEO provider or from a terrestrial provider.
From a federal legal standpoint, there will, I didn't know about Minnesota, but there will be from BEAD some solution that says this eligible location has service to the BEAD program. I actually think that is true.
We'll see. There has to be an applicant for there to be a grant.
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll know pretty soon on that. But so Gigi, I guess the broader question is, what does the end game of BEAD mean for all these other programs, Universal Service, USDA, Reconnect? I mean, like the whole...
Well, aren't they zeroing out Reconnect, right? And so what's to talk about? Yes, this will make Universal Service. So the original idea, we could talk about the original idea of the bill, because it certainly was to build infrastructure, not to subsidize infrastructure that was already built, and that's what's happening, right? But the idea, I believe, because the FCC was ordered to look at the BEAD and DEA programs and figure out its impact on the Universal Service Fund, which probably meant shrinking the high-cost programs. Now that we're going in this direction, I think USF gets breathed into it again. And I think actually makes it even more important than it was before for Congress to fix the Universal Service Fund, both the contribution side and the distribution side. I don't think USF is ever going away, even though there are some on Capitol Hill that would like that to happen. So I actually think USF becomes even more important at this juncture and becomes even more critical because of the reasons stated. But if I could just talk about one other thing, prediction for the future. I've bored probably half of this audience telling you to read the New Yorker article on Howard Lutnick from July 21st, because it is really instructive about what might happen here. Okay, he, unbeknownst to me at the time, he was one of the architects of the DOGE program. And he lives to make money and bring money back to the government. And I think what he wants to do is have a big bag of money with big dollar sign that he could give to Donald Trump, maybe up to $20 billion. That's one of the reasons I believe that, unfortunately, the states will never see the non-deployment money. And I think when you look at it through his lens, that's all he cares about. And that's why I do think, I gave a speech at Broadband Communities, whether the new policy statement was a course correction or whether it was RDOF 2.0. And I really fear that the focus on saving money is going to send us to an RDOF 2.0 and probably even worse.
Well, fundamentally, the argument, or the aphorism that's proven true over and over again in my personal life, that is proving true in professional life, is a conservative one, and it's you get what you pay for. That's going to be true in this program as well.
So if I could just finish my thought. My prediction for 5 years into the future is that we will be coming back again and asking Congress for another multiple tens of billions of dollars, because the digital divide in rural America and frankly in urban America will still be here and still be very strong. And I just think that is a national shame.
Right, so Kevin, I want to go to one other forward-looking topic. So, actually, I think if you talk to industry folks in the room and elsewhere, BEAD and rural deployment is still important, but it's almost a bit of a rearview mirror thing. It's this whole AI infrastructure, the hyperscalers, all of that is what's really driving investment. And of course, that's a big government policy too. The administration released that AI action plan not long ago. So just thought exercise. What if you were still advising the Commerce Secretary, you're still at the Commerce Department, knowing what you know about BEAD and these programs and this idea that AI infrastructure is the next big thing? What would you be doing? How should this group be thinking about that?
I guess pretty simplistically, you cannot have a data center in your region without fiber. So, it will be ironic to see what happens with the non-deployment dollars, but in a world where the Commerce Department is going to authorize states to spend it, I think AI and data centers is a pretty good bet, and that will require fiber. So instead of building fiber out to people's homes, we'll build it out to data centers. And I think that Fiber Broadband put out a report. I think the estimate is over 200 million additional miles of fiber are needed to meet the data needs for AI. And so if I were still in the Commerce Department, I would be saying, we need to use this money to build fiber, because that's how you're going to get data centers and AI in rural America.
I think people don't fully appreciate the scale of construction and the change in model that's going to be necessary to move toward modern AI development. As a Virginian, I love that so much of the world's compute is in Virginia, but that won't work for people elsewhere. There will be hyperscale data centers that will be hubs, but we're going to need to move a ton more data center capacity much closer to the end users. There's tons of states that don't even have a single internet exchange point at all. We have to change all of that to get this infrastructure out into the world. All of that requires a much more robust fiber network than we have today, or than anybody's contemplating building. But in the absence of that, there will be a new digital divide. It'll be an AI divide. And there will be a set of communities where you can bake full use of artificial intelligence, and there will be a set of communities where you can't. And economic activity is going to flow to those communities where you can make full use of AI, and it will flow away from those communities where you can't.
I got to say, if we keep arguing about data centers, if that's our best argument, we're never going to win. Number one, there's a lot of controversy around data centers in this country. People who live near data centers hate them. okay? And they have huge environmental impacts. We have to talk about the impact on people's everyday lives, what Veneeth was talking about, okay? Again, it's great to have this technological conversation about data centers and AI. I don't think that actually, if you're trying to move public opinion, that's not going to do it.
Well, Gigi, to be fair, I think we have to do both. I mean, if you're talking about, like, the question that was posed to Kevin, which is, all right, we've got to look at the economy and make smart choices. This is more of sort of an inside baseball elite conversation, right? Which is like, let's look forward, let's look downstream and see what the economy needs and how it's going to play out. That, I think, is separate from the broader public conversation about how this is going to change people's lives. But I do think there's going to be I think the bridge between those two is, look, if I'm in a rural community that doesn't get broadband and isn't going to get broadband, I'm going to say, listen, y'all have been left behind before and you're going to get left behind again. The folks in the cities are going to have access to this AI technology and you're not.
Well, look, I'll tell you in Louisiana, I'll take a little bit of a contrarian view on the impacts that data centers are going to have in rural communities, especially in Louisiana. Last December, the governor announced with Meta I think the largest hyperscale AI data center called Hyperion, which is actually going to be in the poorest part of the state in northeast Louisiana, in Richland Parish. So obviously tons of construction jobs, tons of what I think is going to be an ecosystem of livelihood projects that are going to help support and feed the success of that data center. But what we also did was we actually also plotted out within a 5 to 10 mile circumference of that data center, how many BEAD eligible locations are there of folks that currently do not have BEAD? And what we projected was that there were close to 1,000 households and small businesses that currently do not have internet. And so from the governor's perspective, and I know we'll talk, I think, a little bit about non-deployment, his thought process is how we can use the best of the infrastructure as an asset enabler and as a platform to drive Louisiana's success. And so if data centers, which it is going to be, I think, a bigger play just given the energy and other resources in Louisiana that exist, how do you start to marry those investments with BEAD eligible locations, with workforce development to create a better educated workforce?
Well,
is his goal.
Well, one thing that's really important, it is a luxury for the communities that don't like data centers to not like data centers. I did rural economic development in low-income communities for years where the population had been shrinking. It costs the same amount to run a third grade classroom with 5 kids in it as it does to run a third grade classroom with 30 kids in it. That data center that shows up and pays taxes and doesn't require a ton of public services is a godsend to that rural county. And there are a ton of, with adequate infrastructure, we could stop overburdening the communities that have too many data centers and spread that around, which will both have positive economic impacts in the short term and long term will offer economic opportunity to those communities.
Kevin, I'm going to go back to one thing on the AI topic. So, I mean, Gigi and Evan seem pretty firm that they think non-deployment is not going to be a thing. Do you see a scenario where maybe like there's a smart move that says actually non-deployment could be centered on sort of an AI agenda? Because that is something the administration clearly wants to do. I mean, do you see that as like a possible path as opposed to just non-deployment kind of sits there on the sidelines?
I mean, I feel like Gigi's yo-yo, I would say, I feel like we're on a roller coaster and you're like up and down, up and down. The optimistic view is absolutely. There are a lot of ways that the non-deployment dollars could be invested to advance Trump administration priorities while giving states the room to choose projects that work for their state. But I think it's a big open question whether that is too optimistic a view. I think, if you want to take the pessimistic view, I think you would say that that non-deployment's going to go the way of digital equity.
So in a second, we'll go to questions. So if you have questions, start thinking about them. I want to have Veneeth kind of do maybe the last word on this kind of structured part of the agenda. So, you've always been one of the leading states. I think as always, Louisiana's, pretty close to the front of the pack on all the new stuff. What's your current mindset, Veneeth? What's Louisiana's plan? What would you be watching if you were in the audience and want to know what's going to happen? I mean, you know more than almost anybody about where this might be going. And so what's your advice to the audience and what's your mindset?
It's tough because there's a great deal of empathy that I have for all of the folks in the room who have spent years and years and tons of dollars in trying to buoy up an industry, but also to solve a problem that largely hasn't been solved for a long time, right? So when June 6th happened, from our perspective, I think that was a Friday. I think June 6th was a Friday. I told our team, take off. Not take off. We work a lot.
How generous.
How generous, right?
To take the weekend off.
That's right. But I did say, look, let's get back to work on Monday and start grinding again. And that's always been our MO, John, frankly, for the last couple of years, which has been, again, we spent so much time in the community. We have personally visited over 120 cities, towns, and villages around the state of Louisiana. We keep getting constituent calls. But for our perspective, when we're fortunate in Louisiana that part of our success, or a great deal of part of our success, has always been we've had a governor and the legislature and the community all absolutely aligned with trying to work with a sense of urgency and giving our office the ability to help to influence federal decision making and help to really set the pace for the country in terms of policy and execution. So June 6th happened, weekend, Monday we got to work, and we feel very strongly, we're very close to publishing our results. We feel very strongly with the results. Before June 6th, if you all recall, in our final proposal, our deployment costs were going to be $750 million. So our allocation was $1.35 billion, which meant we were going to have over $500 million in non-deployment funds. We started working last year with Governor Landry, who really prioritized the use of those non-deployment dollars to impact farmers, right? To help address a primary care shortage gap in North Louisiana using telehealth and AI, which RFK Jr. talks about telehealth and AI, right? And so a focus on maternal care and chronic disease management. So those were our results before. We're going to have even more efficient results, which means potentially we might have more funds available for non-deployment. And so those are things that we're going to have evolving conversations with NTIA and other folks within the White House to talk about the best uses potentially of those funds.
We can take questions now. We cannot see anything. We're looking into these bright lights. So somebody out there, Doug, or somebody yell and let us know if there's a question. And please introduce yourself if you have a question so the panel knows who's talking. And again, we can't see. So I'll give it a second here. And then I do have one other topic we can go into if we don't have questions.
Someone's got a mic.
It's Jeff
Carl.
Sabatka of Vivacity
Jeff.
Infrastructure
Jeff.
Group, way here in the back.
Okay.
My question for the panel, and maybe you could answer this individually or as a group, do you anticipate that the non-deployment funds, the use of the non-deployment funds, will wind up in court where states will sue to keep the funds?
I hope they will. I hope they will. Can I just, while I've got the floor, I just do want to say that I so admire the SBOs. I just think they've done an amazing job. I still have faith in them that they will get the best they will squeeze the best lemonade out of this lemon. But I just think, I would give them a round of applause because I just think they've done an amazing job.
Yeah, to echo that, I was saying often during the BEAD program that one of the unlooked for lasting benefits of it was going to be the addition of resources and the elevation of state broadband offices across the country. And those offices are not going to go away, and they're going to continue to provide benefits to their states for quite a long time. And there's also this incredibly talented cadre of people across the country, and y'all are really remarkable folks.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on the litigation question? No? Okay.
Thank you. Carl Guardino with Toronto Wireless. First, I want to thank each of you for the passion and the professionalism that you have all brought to the task of bridging the digital divide for every American family. The question and the comment will be very brief. We are hoping and depending on the NTIA and the 56 state and territorial broadband officers to keep the high standards for priority broadband. It has to meet, and we think preferably exceed, the reliable, high-speed, low-latency, scalability provisions so that everyone gets what they deserve, as Evan pointed out. So we hope that happens. But let's look beyond BEAD for a moment, if you can comment, because hopefully we're going to still be building homes and businesses and churches and schools and hospitals. So there's going to be need for connectivity long past BEAD and the current infrastructure of homes, businesses, schools, hospitals, healthcare facilities in the United States. Is there going to still be a robust role of the federal government looking forward for all of those homes and businesses that are still to come?
Well, I think there's going to be a role for the federal government in the continuation and evolution of USF that was discussed earlier, but I also think there's a really important role for the states here. We need to put, people used to say, if BEAD works, what keeps you up at night? And I would say, somebody coming back and Swiss cheesing that otherwise colored in map. We need to be changing at the state level, building codes and development requirements in the same way we did with water, sewer, and electrical. You're not allowed to build a development that doesn't have running water anymore. You're not allowed to build it if it's for mainline. You can build a hunting camp, but you can't build a new neighborhood that doesn't have access to water and electricity. You need to have a plan for broadband connectivity in that community as well. It can be wireless, it can be wired, but there has to be. We have to change that requirement so that we don't come back later and reinvent this problem that we're on the verge of solving.
So in other words, broadband is utility. When are we finally actually going to just say that out loud? It is utility. It is as necessary as water and electricity. I think everybody in the country believes that except for people in Washington, D.C. And I think that's one of the things that is holding us back in so many ways.
I want to comment on Carl's comment, which I think is really important and something we didn't really cover through your questions, John. Brooke Donlin spoke yesterday and was asked, how is BEAD not going to suffer the same fate as RDOF? And she, I think very rightfully identified that one distinguishing feature around BEAD is the priority broadband project definition. I think Brooke was also very sincere and was accurate when she said that Congress's intent in developing a 56 state and territory program was to shift decision-making down to folks who knew better the needs of their communities. One of the most important parts of the priority broadband definition in my mind is the assessment of the future needs, the evolving needs of those communities. And so I think I equally agree that the state broadband offices have been incredible throughout this effort and resilient in the face of change. And to Evan's point, they are populated with some of the smartest, most talented people working on broadband. I hope that they will use the discretion that Congress gave them and that Brooke reiterated, and I take her at her word that NTIA will allow the states to use that discretion to uphold that high definition of a priority broadband project. To me, that's the ball game on whether this turns out to actually meet the goals that Congress had for this program, or whether we end up in a situation where we have an RDOF 2.0.
But that comes back to, these things happen all the time, and there were some that happened in the Biden administration. It's what's happening now with this new rule set. We engage in these fictions as opposed to stating plainly what's going on, right? So the way that states will get a good outcome from the current rule set is not to say this technology doesn't meet the future needs of these locations, because that's not permitted. So instead they'll come up with a fantasy argument that, oh, in this specific project area, LEO doesn't work for X, Y, or Z reasons. And NTIA, even though that's not really what's driving why that's not a priority project in that area, NTIA will say, well, that's okay, right? Because you've made an argument here, right? And then that'll happen over and over again, and the better states will do a better job of sort of excluding LEO from more areas, and a worse job, and some states will do a worse job and do it less. But none of that's what's actually so. It's here's the rule set that we're going to pretend is real, and here's the fig leaf you can use to cover up the way you're sidestepping that rule set. And that's just an insane way to run a railroad. And like, I don't understand why, like, I do understand because politics is terrible and ruins policy. But the reality is that we're asking states now to do a two-step that involves a wink and a nod if they're going to get a good outcome. And that seems to me to be very disingenuous.
So Carl, look, really appreciate, Carl, your help in eliminating the digital divide in Louisiana. I've seen it firsthand, right? We've funded a project of AMG Next Link through the ARPA program, and people are getting high-speed quality internet. I know we talk about BEAD a lot, but actually the issue in Louisiana is also we've got a ton of RDOF. We've got 132,000 locations that have to be built out over the next 5-6 years. We have 66,000 ARPA locations that have to be built out by December of next year, right? So while we talk about BEAD, we talk about Priority Broadband Project, our issue and my sort of fear is we're 4 years down the road and suddenly RDOF collapses and suddenly you have tens of thousands of households, right? BEAD is not run very efficiently from a CapEx perspective. So then trying to convince a BEAD participant that's built somewhere to then pick up those locations, that's what keeps us up at night, right? Is how do we maniacally create, and I think this speaks to how states can be efficient in their sub-grant program, right? How can they maniacally be efficient in leveraging the different federal funds, whether RDOF, whether it's ARPA, to make BEAD efficient so that they all actually work together in unison as opposed to in that disaggregate.
Maybe one more question?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hey, Paul Dickinson, Smart Infrastructure Solutions. As a member of Fiber Broadband and several other nonprofits focused on the resilience of our infrastructure, the future value of fiber is very important to me and several of the organizations I represent. One of the things that I think needs to be brought to the forefront, in addition to latency, in addition to community development and growth through their businesses, are the other advantages that fiber can implement in the US and globally, such as through sensing capabilities. And I just wanted to comment, and I know I've talked with Evan about this privately, but the ability for fiber in the rural and the cities and everywhere to be able to monitor all that infrastructure we're going to build and make it more resilient against damage and better monitored is something that I think many of us are not aware of and many of us haven't really focused on yet. But as we talk about fiber versus LEOS and other technologies, it's very important to think not just about broadband growth and all the broadband-based technologies that will be used on fiber, but what fiber can also do that will not be in place if we don't implement it across the US and across the world, even into the rural.
I mean, thankfully, the priority broadband, the definition of a priority broadband is not only just scalability, but it's also the ability to work with 5G and successor wireless technologies and other advanced technologies. So Brooke left that second part off yesterday. She just talked about the ability to work with wireless, but it's also the ability to work with new technologies that may come through in the future. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
But I would encourage people to look into this. The capability for fiber to sense other physical activity in its presence, it blew me away when I started reading some of the stuff that I was being sent. And we're just scraping the surface now of the sorts of things we can learn for disaster recovery, for active traffic management, for logistics and delivery tracking, for seismology. I mean, there's this incredible array of things that we can learn with this new sensory organ that we're building in the form of our fiber network nationwide that's really, really, really remarkable.
Any final words, anybody? No? Okay.
Well, I do have one thing. I mean, of course.
We're not
We have a minute and 23, come on. It's kind of sad and kind of ironic. I actually think, so I wear a lot of different hats, as John says, in addition to being Executive Director of the American Association for Public Broadband, which represents communities that want to own their own infrastructure. I also work for the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. But ironically, sort of the failure of RDOF, the situation that BEAD is in, actually, I think is driving more people to consider a community-owned infrastructure. So if anybody is interested in doing that, come talk to me.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Hope this was interesting. And go ahead, Doug. Yeah.
Great panel. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
We have a ton of great sessions today, and I'm gonna call an audible. They were scheduled to start at 9. Let's push everything back. Next session's at 9:15, and the following session's at 10:15. Please make sure that you are take a look at the agenda and attend these sessions. There's some excellent sessions today, and I will see you back here at lunch. So thank you very much. Again, 10:15 and 9:15.